So now what I want to do is talk about the Open Networking Foundation for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so. And first I want to talk about the ONF itself, how we've grown, how we've evolved, what the organization looks like. I want to talk a little bit about how we're fitting into the community, but focus primarily on some of the key initiatives that we'd like you to be aware of, and we'd certainly like your participation over the long run. So one of the starting points, this is a chart that's hard to read, I understand, but I think for many of you who look at the analysts, this is a chart that actually indicates technology adoption. It's by Gartner. It's called the hype curve, is what some people call it. And the three red arrows show where we are with respect to NFV, SDN. NFV is the top one, SDN is the second one, and then the third one is OpenFlow. And it's just indicative of how the perceptions and the market is really evolving over the last couple of years, where we started to see OpenFlow in particular and SDN on the rise. Now the reality is starting to sink in, which is expected based on the nature of this curve. And we're starting to see individual organizations start to move into deployment, which is going to help us understand what the real issues are in terms of spreading not only the word, but also being able to leverage what open software-defined networking actually offers. So this chart is somewhat pessimistic in terms of how the fact that when you start to go down the curve, you go into something called the trough of disillusionment, meaning we're beyond the hype and now the reality sets in, and now we have to go deal with lots of issues that we had no idea that even existed until we actually get involved in it. The real indication, though, is based on our good friends from Infinetics, who unfortunately could not be here today, but have been here in the past, that indicate that the market for SDN and NFV, for that matter, just for the hardware, is expected to grow orders of magnitudes over the next 4 or 5 years. And they're predicting greater than $10 billion over 2018. We've seen other forecasts in the $10 to $50 billion range, depending where it is. The numbers aren't that critical. They're indicators of what kind of momentum we can expect to see in the next few years. And if we looked at what is the driver behind that, it's the compelling value proposition that OpenSDN brings with offering and enabling operators a new generation of not only services they can offer, but innovative and differentiated services. And that's especially critical in a more competitive landscape. And at the same time, leveraging automation to drive down operational costs, and then even down to using equipment more efficiently, not to mention enabling some of the lower cost, more commoditized equipment to be able to be introduced into the network to reduce CapEx cost or capital expense as well. So SDN and OpenSDN and OpenNFV actually offer those three-way value proposition of being able to not only work on the revenue side and offer tremendous benefits there, but on the cost reduction side as well. So now I want to shift gears a little bit to the Open Networking Foundation itself. As you can see, the membership has continued to grow. We have over 150 members now, and they span the globe. They span vertical industries. They span everything from semiconductors to large system or really large operators. Some of the world's largest operators have been in the ONF since the beginning. And then on top of that, software companies and hardware vendors in between. One of the more exciting developments that was unanticipated was carrier grade SDN. The idea that operators would be attempting to look ahead and be able to respond to some of the competitive changes that are really transforming the industry by leveraging what software-defined networking and network function virtualization has to offer. On Thursday afternoon, I have a talk that's going to address that in more detail, so I'm going to just touch upon this today and then be able to point to that talk a little bit later. Another major development for the ONF is software. And this is not just producing software, but being able to engage with the open source community. Mike McBride from Ericsson, who's also a leader within the Open Networking Foundation, is going to talk about this a little bit more later on. We have some representatives of leading open source SDN controller projects who are going to be participating on our panel. At the end of the workshop, you'll see that software is really going to be one of the keys to being able to drive adoption of SDN and network function virtualization over the long term. And then, of course, on the membership front, the one thing I wanted to point out is that we have been growing our membership, but one of the things that the Open Networking Foundation did about a year or so ago, or maybe it's a little longer, is to introduce a new class of membership for startups and encourage the innovative, younger companies with a different perspective to be able to participate in the process. And at the same time, we encouraged our research constituents, our research partners who've been there all along, to be able to take a little more active role through our research affiliates program. So what we've attempted to do is to go beyond just providing another forum for major vendors and to try to bring together the broader community, both on the technology front, on the innovation front, and then, of course, on the mainstream industry and end users who've been guiding the ONF since the beginning. This is a chart that just indicates the Open Networking Foundation organization. For those of you who attended last year, we had a different structure. That's why I brought this chart to the table. I ordinarily don't want to spend too much time on the internals of the ONF, but it is significant that what the ONF has done is we've restructured our organization around the tremendous growth that we've experienced over the last 18 months. And I don't intend to go through everything, but what I want to say is that before, if you looked at anything like this, you would see 15 or 20 working groups and discussion groups and leadership councils that all, in essence, reported up to the executive director. And we realized that over a period of time that's not going to be the way to grow in the future. We needed to add a leadership level in between the board of directors and the actual working groups that are actually creating the ONF standards and the ONF initiatives that we're driving forward. And Andy Mellis, who's sitting in the back from Huawei, is one of those leaders of the four areas that we created: the services area, the operator area, the specifications area, and the market area, which I chair. And these are intended to provide a framework structure to encourage collaboration on everything we do across the entire ONF. And then there's some other activities that we have been working to get off the ground. One of them is the operator console and the operator area, which is a forum that we invite all of the operators that are part of the ONF to participate in. This is a group that helps guide the use cases, requirements, and ultimately the priorities of what the ONF actually spends time on. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit more about some of the key initiatives that are underway. The first one is the Northbound Interface, and the reason I started here is that because we had to make an adjustment to the program, I added a presentation on the Northbound immediately following this presentation, since Gint Atkinson from KVH and Colt could not join us. But suffice it to say that one of the most important areas that we're working on right now is the Northbound. And think of it as how applications integrate with the SDN architecture. And I'm not going to cover this in too much detail since I have more details a little bit later. But the idea is to be able to, we created a working group that's been focusing on this for about a year, or actually closer to 2 years now when we include the discussion group. And the intent of that working group was to be able to look around at all the controller development and activities and try to come up with some recommendations, some intelligent recommendations on what we should do in terms of responding to the need to be able to create a common API framework that would enable application developers to be able to take their applications and move them across different controllers without having to completely rewrite them. And then also, of course, by decoupling those applications from the underlying network infrastructure, it also achieves their interest of being able to create a more seamless an abstracted model for how applications interact with the network. So I'll say a little bit more a little later. Another key initiative, and this one might surprise you a little bit, is OpenFlow. We had been spending in the first couple of years of the Open Networking Foundation, for those of you who have been with us throughout this journey, we've been spending a lot of activity focusing on OpenFlow. Until last year, I'd say 2014, the intent of the ONF was to not just be constrained to OpenFlow, but to be able to look at the architecture and look at some of the issues that are addressed, that we needed to address to enable our end user, different individuals and organizations to be able to deploy and be able to refine the SDN architecture. And we'll talk about some of those throughout the day. But OpenFlow still has a key role. And I think it pays to come back to look at what is OpenFlow all about? Why is it important? And why did I choose this as one of the key initiatives for this year? Well, or shall I say, why did the ONF choose to refocus our attention around OpenFlow? Well, the first thing is that we need to create a programmable network, to create a network that's open and that's abstracted from the underlying details of the network and enable applications to be able to, again, seamlessly be able to port across different environments. We need to have an open programmable interface and an abstracted switch model that will enable us to leverage the common control layer that's been at the heart of the ONF SDN architecture. That's why OpenFlow is important. Now, does that mean that every switch or every piece of hardware is going to support OpenFlow? Certainly not. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that that's the ultimate goal and vision for the open networking or the open SDN movement, is to be able to provide a more open architecture. And the way to do that is through open abstracted interfaces, both on the northbound side, which is what we'll talk about in a minute, and then on the southbound side, or in other words, from the control layer to the underlying infrastructure layer. The problem we're trying to solve with OpenFlow is fairly simple. It's enabling multi-vendor interoperability. But that in itself is not openness. That's a part of openness. It's also important that we have a community around that openness so that one single vendor doesn't dominate the way we do anything. Matter of fact, our definition for openness is not just multi-vendor, but it's also vendor neutral. So keep that term in mind when you think about what we're talking about throughout the day. Our approach has been to create specifications, to create a broad set of what we refer to as the OpenFlow substrate, which are other specifications like management, conformance test, other mechanisms that we need to enable the introduction of a new control mechanism into the architecture. And it's also incumbent, like all the other initiatives that the Open Networking Foundation is involved in, is that we participate in the community. Open SDN is far greater than any one organization can lay claim to. I mean, you may hear it with some of the interactions you have with individual companies or other groups, but if we look at how pervasive Open SDN is, how it's transforming everything we do, no matter where you are in the overall industry, and this includes some of the groups that you don't think about, like the press or analysts. They have to go rethink how they've segmented the work that they've done. Not to mention all the operators, all the OEMs, all the software companies who are also participating. Even the silicon vendors have to rethink what they're doing because their SDKs and the kind of integration to their chipsets have to be rethought in the context of SDN. So clearly we have to be able to collaborate with a number of different industry groups, standards bodies, and open source projects. Now, what we've done in the Open Networking Foundation specifically is we created a working group called Extensibility. It may not be the obvious intuitive name for the OpenFlow group, but this is the group that actually is responsible for the OpenFlow specification. So when you go on to the Open Networking Foundation site at opennetworking.org and then download the OpenFlow specification, it's because of the group, the extensibility working group, that has defined and refined the requirements over a very, very long period of time, even predating the Open Networking Foundation. That goes back to 2011. We have the Configuration Management Working Group, and they're responsible for actually how we manage OpenFlow. And they're looking not only at OF config, for those of you familiar with the substrate and the details, but they're looking at other ways to look at management as well. The Forwarding Abstractions Working Group gets involved in how we're actually implementing OpenFlow, providing mechanisms to make it more efficient to integrate switches and controllers. And then the Testing and Interoperability Working Group is providing a very valuable service of enabling both conformance testing to the OpenFlow specification, but also performance and interoperability testing, which is different than conformance on top of that. Some of the deliverables are shown here. Many of them are public for OpenFlow, so we'd encourage you to sort of rethink and re-examine OpenFlow in the context of what you're doing, whether you're on the operator side, whether you're on the OEM side, because the ultimate goal is to be able to achieve an open, multi-vendor, vendor-neutral infrastructure for the programmable network, and that term programmability is the operative term. Next, I want to talk a little bit about software. We have a number of initiatives, including the open source announcements that you recently saw, or you may have seen. First of all, let's look at the problem. What is the problem that we've been trying to solve? Well, the problem is very straightforward. We want to accelerate open SDN adoption. That's the mission of the Open Networking Foundation, and we'll continue to be able to strive toward widespread adoption across our major segments. And our customer segments include the data center, where things really got started, the carrier and WAN segment, that's the term we use to define telecommunications, SDN and the WAN and so forth, and then enterprise campus, which has gained more momentum, I think primarily because of the activities of the ETSI NFV ISG, Industry Specification Group, that are underway. Well, we have actually taken an approach of becoming more involved in open source, but at the same time being able to integrate along with the rest of the community. And the Open Networking Foundation continues to be the group that's the champion for OpenSDN, the forum for other groups who have, in most cases, approached the Open Networking Foundation around bringing together the community to ensure that open source developments, for instance, with controllers, or other development activities, some of even the orchestration efforts that are going on, as we'll see with the Metro Ethernet Forum activities that'll be talked about on Thursday. All of those activities are actually coordinated across the industry, as opposed to from one group's perspective. We recently formed the Software Leadership Council to be able to look at this and then be able to make some targeted decisions about actually implementing open source projects, but we're also working with the open source community to be able to integrate what we're doing and influence what the open source projects are doing, and to ensure that they're addressing the end user needs for the open SDN architecture. And you might have seen some of the announcements which have been public about something called Open Source SDN. And you can take a look at that URL, and you can see and get a sense of some of the open source development activity that we do have underway. Carrier grade SDN, as I said, is another really important initiative. The problem, of course, is to be able to extend the ONF SDN architecture to the carrier and network. We picked a couple of different areas, which is optical transport, which has really been the group, one of the highlights of the Open Networking Foundation over last year. And you'll have to come to our talk on Thursday to be able to get a little more insight as to how that's unfolding. Mobile wireless network is another. Security and architecture, something called the Carrier Grade Discussion Group, which was formed to be able to look across different applications and different segments that the carriers were addressing to be able to address different needs that are specific to the telecommunications and carrier environment. Again, many, many collaborations. This activity and this segment has more associated liaison organizations than really any of the other groups. I mean, and it's the major activities and groups that you're very familiar with. The OIF, who we partnered with for the major telecommunications demonstration last year, that the OIF and the Open Networking Foundation got involved in to demonstrate to Open Transport SDN. The TMF, which is one of our partners for the development of the Northbound Interface. At the NFE, we had the first industry partnership with the NFE group to talk about how SDN can support the NFE architecture, and we have an activity specifically focused on that called Layer 4 through 7 services that you'll hear a little bit more about this week. And there's more groups as well. I mean, and of course the Metro Ethernet Forum that I somehow left off this slide inadvertently, who's looking at orchestration, and we're going to be integrating that with the SDN architecture. So there's many, many groups. It's a very active community. There's many, many operators, as you'll see. And one of the keys is that the APAC region has been one of the bright spots, and that the response has been tremendous, both in terms of the major OEMs, in terms of the operators, in terms of the operators' research extension in groups that are participating. So now I want to just wrap things up, at least so we can have time for at least a few questions, and talk about, well, what's really happening on this front about adoption. And I think some of you at least are aware of at least these very high visibility deployments of SDN. In AT&T with their Domain 2.0 initiative is really changing the way AT&T does everything. Over 10 years, though. It's not going to happen overnight. They've been working on it for a while, and they expect major changes, measurable results before 2020. CenturyLink has done a lot to integrate SDN and NFE. CenturyLink is a major carrier in North America. And then, of course, NTT Communications from the region has been one of the leaders in adopting OpenSDN and actually deploying SDN to enable new generations of cloud services and communication services to increase their relevancy among their enterprise customers as well as their other carrier partners. So no question that we're seeing a demand that's sustainable over the long term. This chart, I apologize for, I know it's a little bit difficult to read. This is an indication from an Infinetics survey of major operators representing about half of the global CapEx spend. These are operators who, if you take all the spending on hardware and software, represent over half of the world's spend. And what it indicates, the question is, they ask operators, are you going to deploy SDN or NFE, and when would that be? This is the answer to the question of whether they would be deploying. And 97% indicated in this survey that they will be deploying SDN, and 93% are going to be deploying NFE. And the reason I've been talking about SDN and NFE so in the same light, or in the same together so much, is because SDN and NFE are very complementary technologies. NFE is hard to imagine how it could be deployed on a broad scale without an SDN architecture. But these numbers are very, very staggering. 97% of operators are planning, at least examining their plans for SDN in the near future. I don't have the data that indicates the when, but if we look at this, I've spoken to the author of this survey, Michael Howard, who is a very familiar face in this community. Within 3 years, we're going to be seeing things from many of the world's largest operators. And what we would expect to see is additional progress even before that for some of the smaller operators, which is what we're seeing in North America, what we're seeing in some of the operators here in the region. And that's a very encouraging step. So with that, I just want to pause for a minute. I think we have quite a bit of time for questions. And I think what we want to do is to at least encourage you to ask questions about the Open Networking Foundation, our liaisons, anything I talked about, or even anything else that's on your mind, even though recognize we're going to have a number of other speakers who will be talking. So we have a couple of microphones, I think, in the back. So does anybody have a question? Someone want to be first? Okay, Mark, thank you.
Sure. Yes, I was struck by the it's always nice to see the growth in membership numbers. I don't know if you could say a bit more about kind of new classes of members, or what really stood out in terms. It's seen quite a strong growth year on year.
It's been a very strong growth, Mark, and thank you for the question. The membership, I think part of the growth has been the startup membership class. Clearly that's had a significant impact in the number of members that have joined the Open Networking Foundation. We're encouraging, reaching out to bring in the most innovative companies, not just innovative companies. You have to look at it from the startup perspective. A large company who has an ongoing business, they can be committed to software-defined networking by putting millions of dollars into research. That's very different than creating an SDN or NFV startup that your livelihood is dependent on the adoption of SDN and or NFV, like the company I represented, ClearPath Networks. So it's a very different perspective. It brings a sense of urgency, it brings a fresh perspective, and it certainly brings a lot to the ONF community. And it also it allows a leveling of the playing field in the sense that even a smaller operator can take on a significant role within the ONF, contribute. It's about bringing together the right and a very diverse group of individuals and organizations to be able to address the overall goal, which is to champion OpenSDN and strive for adoption. So Dan, do you want to say something?
An important aspect of that growth has actually come from Asia. And it's partly because of these new bodies that have formed in Asia. Our area director for operator is from Alibaba. It's Judy Zhu. China Mobile has taken a large role in the carrier grade SDN working group. And consequently, other companies have joined as a result of that. Malaysia Telecom joined. Tata Communications has joined. CFI Technologies, the large Indian ISP, the North American operation, has joined. And these are just indications of a growing interest in the region, what's happening in Korea, what's happening in Taiwan. The sort of even pseudo-government organizations in those countries and in Korea and in China, CATR, which is part of the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and their name has just changed to 5 letters from 4. I don't know what they are right now. They not only joined, but they're becoming active. And we've got now testing facilities for conformance testing, 2 in China, 1 in Taiwan, 1 in India, applications coming in from Korea and other places. And these are really signs of market growth and interest. And so Mark, I think one of the big factors actually is Asia-Pac.
Exactly, and I would also observe, Dan, that the OEMs are also responding as well, because one of our other area directors who's sitting in the back is from Huawei, and so Huawei's been active, and not to mention ZTE and a number of other smaller companies as well, both within the U.S. and based in the U.S. and based in the region. Yes, question.
Hi. So I have 2 questions actually.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Yan Sandra. I work for Globe Telecom in the Philippines. I'm brand new on all these topics, and I'm not familiar with all these open organizations. But it looks to me that there are many, and I was wondering how we are coordinating all this, and is ONF the body to actually coordinate all this work around the SDN and NFV in the open world? That's the first question. And the second is since we are talking about open source, are the vendors, traditional vendors like Huawei, Alcatel, considering to use this open source development for their own product or part of it, or so I don't know if they can answer to this question.
Those are excellent and timely questions, and I hope that our workshop will answer some of those questions as well. But I'll give you a preview, especially on the first one. And the question, I'll just paraphrase it again or restate it a little bit. The question is, we have a number of industry groups. Why ONF? Why is the ONF the place that they're coming? Well, first of all, recognize that the Open Networking Foundation has certainly been receptive and have been reaching out, but the reality has been also these groups are coming to the Open Networking Foundation as well. We don't have to necessarily convince them that this is the place to be. They're seeking us out as well. ETSI-NFE would be one, Metro Ethernet Forum, OIF. Some of those groups, especially in telecommunications, are recognizing that SDN is bigger than what they thought originally, and they need to be able to respond, but they can't just respond themselves, so they want to be able to ensure that their activities are coordinated across the industry. And they picked the Open Networking Foundation as a group that they feel comfortable in working with because of our collaborative style, because of our openness as an organization, and most importantly, because we're driven by the operator, the end user, really the network operator considerations over the vendor considerations, which have traditionally been the groups that have been driving a lot of the standards and open, well, we haven't had open source activities, but recently open source activities. So ONF has been recognized as at least a key place as a starting point and as an open and collaborative group to be able to discuss the issues that cut across multiple different groups, and then be able to help influence the activities to ensure that every group isn't going and recreating the architecture or recreating an open programmable interface or recreating management. We want to be able to get to the point where every group takes a role and participates. There will be some competition across some of the groups. It's bound to happen. And then be able to come back and then be able to create a more validated and seamless integrated approach as opposed to the way things worked in the past where, frankly, many of these groups competed.
Some of the operators have wondered, well, what do I do? All these groups how do I apply my resources efficiently? And are they duplicating efforts? And we never want to duplicate efforts. So I pulled together a roundtable. You'd get together periodically with the executive directors of the Open Networking Lab for ONOS, Open Daylight, the Open Compute Project, OPNFV, and OpenStack. So we're informed of what each other is doing. We're actually trying to work together and collaborate because we're all trying to solve the same problem, which is democratize the technology, give operators more flexibility, make it easier actually for the vendors to differentiate themselves instead of all doing the same thing. And because we're united in our goal and we're all contributing different ways of achieving that goal. It's a big picture, and there's plenty of work for everybody.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
The gentleman from Globe had a question regarding vendors using open source. So, Richard Wade from Cisco.
Actually, yes, let me address that before I inadvertently skip that over. About open source, and if we look at open source, how did open source all of a sudden become such a big part of what we're doing? And I think there's a couple of factors. The first is that if we look at the major open source projects, who are the people who are participating? It's individuals from the major vendors who are actually investing in open source as a way to create some of the pieces that they view as non-differentiating, meaning the pieces that are better served if the community develops them versus one individual company developing them on their own. And not to mention one individual company shouldering all the investment where they can take advantage of the community to be able to reduce the development costs, improve the quality, reduce the time to actually achieve the platforms that are non-differentiating, meaning everybody, it's in everybody's interest to have a common platform versus to have very specific platforms that are not compatible with one another. So what we've seen is that for projects like Open Daylight, we know and Phil Robb is who I don't see here yet, or maybe on his way, who's from the Open Daylight community, is going to have a presentation tomorrow and talk about how Open Daylight is unfolding. There's 50 members. There's a number of products that have been developed. There's hundreds of contributors. ONOS, which Bill is going to be talking about as well. I think he's got a talk tomorrow or Thursday. Thank you, Bill. And he's talking about the ONOS, the Open Networking Operating System. There's a number of major partners, major operators that are investing as well. Ryu in the region from NTT is a controller that's actually starting to gain some momentum in various different, well, certainly in APAC and in other circles as well. So there's a lot of activity in open source, and the vendors are responding. The vendors are participating, and the vendors view open source as the means of being able to take advantage of the community without having to sacrifice their own value-added offering. Mike McBride is going to talk about this in a little more detail. I think he's going to touch on some of these topics, so I'm going to hold the rest of the question until then. And with that, thank you for... Yeah, I know. I just said I was going to say thank you for reminding me. And
that's okay. So Richard Wade from Cisco. So yes, you're correct. We do see a lot of value in the open source community and the open source projects that are ongoing. And in answer to the gentleman's question, companies such as Cisco do have a lot of dedicated internal development resource that are full-time assigned to developing code for projects such as OpenStack, Open Daylight, etc. So the participation that was being alluded to isn't just financial. We don't just sponsor and throw money at these things. We are actually contributing lines of code because the vendors do recognize that this is a meritocracy. It's not just a money pit or a marketing opportunity. So in terms of what we do with that, with the outcome of that, the vendors can then take what is produced by the open source project and provide enhancements to it, which enable it to be more easily deployed by operators, more easily supported by a company such as Cisco who wants to provide post-sales technical support, and ease the integration into network operator environments. So the core of the product is probably still the open source platform, and the vendor will carry on contributing code in and out of that, but there will be enhancements on top, and that's where you as a customer can take your pick where you want to go. The question I had, sorry, was actually...
we have to make it a little quick because but go ahead.
Maybe you're going to cover it later on. I'm interested in, and Dan's talked about this in previous presentations, around the way that you approach standardization, because you've got your own internal specifications and standards activities, and I know that Dan's previously said that you aim to standardize as little as possible. As little as necessary. So I'm just interested in your approach, how you structure that in terms of producing your requirements for standardization, but then how you actually coordinate your standards engagements to make sure you get the right outcomes to fulfill those requirements.
That's a really excellent question. But, and since we're a little bit limited in time, we have a panel discussion called How the SDN is Reshaping Telecommunications Standards that's planned for this afternoon. It's
Perfect.
The last session of the day.
Great. No
if
problem.
we can hold that question till that panel, and then we can bring it up again.
Yeah, sure.
But thank you. But you're right on the thinking that we have. I mean, we certainly have to rethink the process. So with that, thank you for your questions. I think we're off to a good start.